Let's get into the Bible study tonight. We're in Proverbs 22. Proverbs 22. We're moving on from the marriage series. We're not done talking about that issue. We'll come back to it. There's a few other aspects I want to touch on, but I figured in time for Valentine's Day we need to stop talking about love, and so I timed that series perfectly to end the week before Valentine's Day. But we're in Proverbs 22, and we're continuing our way through wisdom. What I want to note, I don't know if any of you guys have done any hiking, but I'll be honest, I did some hiking in New Hampshire. They have several. It's really laughable when you think about it. They're 4,000 footers, and they're like a really big deal to get all of these like 4,000 footers. And then you come out here to California, and it's like, well, that's our starting point. You know, we start at 4,000 feet, we go up to like, and you're like, yeah, be quiet. But anyway, like there's all these 4,000 footers, and they're all named after presidents or important people from history. And so you go from Washington to Lafayette to Jack, and all these. People love to try to get as many of these mountains as they can. And what's interesting is every single one of these trails starts at what you call a trailhead. All right, and it's the parking lot, it's the information sign, it's whatever it is, and it's this location where you start your journey. And so you pull into the parking lot, you pay your parking fee or whatever you do, and then you start hiking up this mountain. And I remember I had a friend, and he and I were hiking up, and we rented snowshoes, and we started making our way up this one trail, and it was an old ski slope. And so in the winter, it's a ski slope, but during certain other times of year, you can hike up it and do stuff. And it was so deep with the snow that we could not even like snowshoe our way up. So we had to kind of go off into the woods, and we worked our way up to the top, and it was fun. But one of the things we did is I think we brought sleds with us because we knew once we got to the top, it would be a little easier to get back down if we did a little bit of sledding. And some of that stuff, is kind of fun if you think ahead. One of the most dangerous areas up there is a place called Tuckerman's Ravine. And it's a place where people they'll hike up with their skis, and then they'll ski down. But again, there's a lot of avalanches, and there's a lot of other things that happen. And there's up on the top of Mount Washington, which is the nearby mountain, they actually have a list of like all the people who've gotten themselves killed, trying to ski down Tuckerman's Ravine. And I'm like, I'm good. I like to survive. But what you do is, it was interesting because as we were hiking one of those trails one time, I noticed people hiking past me carrying skis and all the paraphernalia that they would need in order to ski back down. And so again, this idea of coming up to a trailhead, and you actually have to come ready to go with what you're going to need for the hike back down. So if you're going to go up there and ski, you can't just magically have skis once you get to the top of the mountain. There's no one up there waiting to hand you a set of skis and go, well, congratulations, now you can ski back down, bring these back when you're done. Like, if you want them when you get there, you've got to bring them with you. Or build them, I guess, on the way. The same thing with the sled. If I'm going to hike up that mountain and I'm going to sled back down, I'm either using my backside or I have to bring the sled with me and I sled down with it. And so the idea is I need to show up at the trailhead with what I need. That's one of the real dangers about hiking the Grand Canyon. Because normal mountains, you do all your exertion on the way up, and then it's a little bit easier to come back down. Grand Canyon is dangerous because it's pretty easy to hike down and down and down and down. But then you got to turn around and work your way all the way back up out of that canyon. And I remember one time I was hiking up out of the Grand Canyon, and I ran out of water. And so I had that last hour of a hike, or whatever it was, and I had no water. Any other drink I had was super hot at that point because I'd been hiking all day. And that's one of the things they say. They have to lift people up out of that valley all the time. And you get to pay the helicopter fee because they get down and they cannot get back up because they wore themselves out. And so there's warnings all over these trailheads saying, be ready for what's coming and make sure you know what's coming down the road. So if you're going up there to ski, you bring your skis with you. If you're going up there and it's going to be cold, you bring your winter stuff with you. If you're going to hike down into the Grand Canyon, you better make sure you have the supplies ready to go. You're planning ahead. And so I want to ask us, as we get into Proverbs 22 with that illustration, is, are you preparing a godly trailhead? Like, have you prepared ahead enough to say, where I'm going, these are the resources that I'm going to need? And that's what we've been doing this whole series for the last year and a half going through Proverbs, is basically we're taking a look at the end of the trail and saying, I need these things. Let's start building them now. I need that thing down the road, purity, financial, marriage, whatever it is. I need a certain preparation. I better start building it now. I don't get to the top of the mountain and go, I forgot my skis. Well, it looks like you're not skiing down. You can't get to the top of the mountain and go, man, I really wish I had that friend. Should have built it on the way up. Okay, so I want you to look here because Proverbs 22, I kind of want to start looking at this idea of building a godly trailhead. And look where it starts. And it says, Proverbs 22, verse 1. It says this, a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor than riches and gold. Okay, now bear with me because I want you to see this because there's about 5 verses in a row here. And if you think about the things that are going to help you get ahead in life, if you think about the things that are going to be of great assistance to you, we would list off things like, oh, it would be really nice to be wealthy, or it would be really nice to be connected, or to be born in this family, or whatever. You think about the things that are going to get you ahead. We don't all have access to those things. We're not all conveniently born with all the connections. But we are born with the ability to make friends. We are born with the ability to live in a way that we get a good name. We looked at Joseph this morning, and you notice Joseph, he started out as a slave, worked his way to the top, and then they hit the reset button, and now he's in a prison. Works his way to the top again. Reset button. Thankfully, he didn't have to go all the way down to the bottom. But you see that idea. Joseph, by the time he kind of went through the cycle a few times, Pharaoh looked at him and said, this is a wise man. This is a man who has discernment. This is a man who has knowledge and discretion. And Joseph didn't just magically pop those skis into existence. He honed them over a long period of time, and he kept, if you want to use the expression, he kept his nose clean and kept his name clean. There have been people that we've all met who live in whatever way they want to, and they have a really, really bad reputation, and they're fairly corrupt. And we look at that person and we go, why do you have a corrupt name? Well, because I accepted this bribe, or because I took that deal over there because I wanted a little bit of extra money, or I played the game over. And you think about, even just in politics and the schemes and the things people play. What is it? I am choosing riches over a good name. I am choosing connections over a good name. And I want you to see this because look what happens. God is basically saying there is this great equalizer, which is personal character. There's this great equalizer that says who you actually are is far more valuable than what you could ever obtain. And it says a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor than silver and gold. And then it goes to the next verse, and it says this, the rich and the poor meet together. The Lord's the maker of them all. And so what it's doing is it's basically saying, we all start off at the same point. Yes, some of us have a few more advantages. If I'm hiking up a mountain, it's nice if I'm a little more athletic, or it's nice if I have access to a better backpack. But the root of it all is we start here, we're working our way up there, and the Bible says if you can pick one thing to take along your journey, it's going to be that personal character that gives you a good name. Because it's it's Joseph, who Pharaoh looks at him and says, here's a man of discretion. Here's a man who's wise. And Pharaoh could tell that in a very short conversation with this guy, and probably by checking in with some other references going, I know what you're up to. And that's, again, it's beautiful because what is he doing? He's saying a good name is better to be chosen than anything else you could get. The rich and the poor, they do meet together, but we understand that they are where they are because God made them. And so there's an equality that comes from simply being God's creation. But I want you to see verse 3, because look what happens. It says, a prudent man foreseeth the evil and hideth himself. And so here's what this is doing. I remember it was a complete accident. My uncle is fairly rich. And when I was born, he set up little accounts for every single one of us kids. And so he set up these accounts. He said they're going to mature by the time you turn 18, and here you go. And I remember 2008 with the stock market crash and all the wonderful fun that came along with that. Right before that happened, I had a guy who was trying to get me to take my money from the account that I had it in and put it in with his brokerage firm or whatever he was doing. And I dragged my feet and I lingered and I didn't quite get around to doing it all, and I kind of left it where it was. And then immediately after that, the stock market crashed. That guy's whole firm went out of business. And so I was like, oh, I dodged the bullet. If I had taken all of my money and been a little more proactive, I would have put all my money in with him, and then all of that would have just collapsed, and I would have been left holding the bag and would have had none of that money, if I understand it right. But I want you to think about some of these guys who actually are smart enough to foresee what's coming, and they do that on purpose. Like, it wasn't an accident. Like, in my case, it really was. It was a complete accident that I didn't lose all my money. But some of these guys who can kind of see the way the wind's blowing, and they go, I'm not going that way. To use kind of a silly illustration, I tell you about San Francisco, and San Francisco has all those alleys. And they actually use the alleys, which is so weird because, again, I come from the East Coast. You don't wander alleys in the East Coast. All right, Boston, Massachusetts, you don't tend to hang out in the alleyway. But I want you to imagine you're Boston, Massachusetts. You're walking through an alleyway, and you see this shady individual standing over a person. Looks like a knife in his hand or something. You're like, I don't know quite what's going on there. But I think every single one of us would be smart enough to go, I'm going to go this way. Even if it takes a little longer, I'm not. I mean, it could be that this guy is in like a cake decorating class and he just happens to have the spatula that he's about to decorate the cake. And that guy could have just like tripped and fallen because the cake was just that good. But, you know, I'm just going to make a wild guess that this guy standing in the alley with a shiny object and the guy lying on the ground, nothing good is happening here. And I'm going to go this way. And what the Bible's saying is a prudent man, a man who's got some wisdom, got the two eyeballs in his head. A prudent man is going to be the guy who looks up that alleyway and goes, I saw what happened to the previous guy who walked up that alleyway. I'm not going in that direction. I've told you the story that the Bible in Ephesians would use the term circumspect. Big fancy word. Basically means use your eyes, look at the ground around you, and make sure you're paying attention. And we were hiking up a mountain, and speaking of trailheads, we'd hiked up this mountain, and it was kind of early spring, late winter, and so there was a little bit of water that had flowed across this trail, and it was ice by the time we got there. We didn't know that. There hadn't been an icy river flowing across the trail earlier, and so we were walking up, and this one girl decided to step over the log, and she immediately slipped and went down, and being the supportive people that we were, we laughed, because it was kind of funny. And so she got up, and the next guy came, and he was a Boy Scout. So he had great experience with ice and snow and managing. And so he said, I got this. I'm a Boy Scout. He didn't do anything different than she did. He stepped over that log, and we can all predict exactly what happened to him. He immediately slipped, and he went down, and we laughed at him. Because here he was going, I'm a Boy Scout. I got this. And he steps, and he immediately goes down. The rest of us, being the prudent men, who foresee the evil, which is the slippery ice, and then proceed to go another way. We grabbed onto a nearby tree branch and used it as a stabilizing force so that we could step over, because we had to step over the ice in order to keep going on the trail. There was no avoiding that danger, but I'm not going to do it just on balance alone. I reach up, grab the branch, and every single one of us proceeded to step on the ice, but we were using the branch as leverage, and we kept going on our way. Now we look at that and we say, okay, that first girl, she had no idea what was going on. She didn't know it was slippery. She fell. The second guy, though, being a Boy Scout, should have known better. And he proclaimed how great he was at, I will not fall. And then proceeded to do the exact same thing that the first girl did and proceeded to fall in the exact same way. And so if we look at Proverbs 22, we see, first of all, the idea of, I'm going to choose a good name. I'm going to choose a good character. I'm basically going to do it God's way and let fall what may. Second verse bears out the idea that God has a hand in creating things the way they are. And we have to understand that. But then the third verse here right off the bat says, hey, you are going to see people fall. Sometimes you are going to be that person who regrettably is at the front of the line and you don't know. You're the one who walks into the spider web. You're the one who walks into the ambush. You're the one who slips on the ice. Like, sometimes you are that person, and just because of the nature of life, you happen to be that first person. Okay, fall back on the, hopefully you have a good character and you're relying on God when you fall to get back up. But what this verse is saying is, hey, you saw someone else fall. You saw the track record, and you proceeded to do nothing different. What did you think was going to happen? And so this is kind of the idea of, these are the supplies, if you will, that we're putting in our bag as we start the trailhead. We're saying, I need to get to the top of this mountain, and to do it, this is stuff that's going to help me out on the way. You look at the next verse, verse 4. It says, by humility and fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life. So again, continuing with that same theme, and you think about all the things that we could desire, okay? And you think about all the stuff that we need, and you think about all the stuff that we require to live our life. And I love the way Locke put it. He's like, we have food, and we have water, and we have a house. And you're like, so what do you need? Food, water, and a place to sleep. You know, whether it's a house or an overpass, like whatever the case may be, you need a place to sleep. And the Bible says, hey, generally speaking, and we all understand Proverbs are proverbial. They are general truths. And it says, generally speaking, if you do it God's way, he will take care of you. And look at what he'll do. Because a good name is rather to be chosen than great riches. But he says, hey, if you do it God's way, and if you live humbly, the way God asks you to live, look what it says. Riches, honor, and life. We're going to get to it here in Genesis in just a little bit, but I've already hinted at it. One of the saddest verses toward the end of Genesis is when Joseph's father meets with Pharaoh. Now, mind you, Joseph's father, he died maybe 170, 160. He didn't live tremendously long when you look at the lifespan. I mean, some of his forefathers, but again, he lived roughly the same age as his forefathers, but you know, within a few years. But one of the saddest things that he points out when Pharaoh looks at him and says, you're an old man, how old are you? He goes, few and evil have been the days of my pilgrimage. And he's not talking about, I haven't lived as long as my dad, because he did. I haven't lived as long as my grandfather, because, you know, it was close enough. But what he's doing, he says, I have lived in such a way that it was kind of a miserable life. It wasn't really a life worth living. Like that's kind of his attitude. And if you think back over the course of his life and you're like, oh yeah, you lived for yourself for all these decades, and then you deceived your family to get a little bit ahead, and that backfired on you, and then you were in exile for this period of time, and then you lived working for your uncle for this 20 years, and he deceived you left, right, and center, and then your family deceived you, and then your children went off and killed a whole village, and you look at it and you go, oh wow, you're not kidding. No wonder few and evil are the days of my pilgrimage. And you're like, because he's not talking about the number of days of his life. He's talking about the quality because he chose to do it his way. And that's what I want to point out here, because the Bible is saying, hey, if you live humbly, if you live in the fear of the Lord, if you put those things in your backpack, then there is riches, and there's honor, and then there's a quality of life, not necessarily quantity. And you notice that. And then look at verse 5. Because again, this idea of the trailhead, if I'm looking and I'm walking, and we've done this a few times up in the redwoods, where you just kind of pick a trail and you just go on it. You see where it goes. And every now and then you stumble off the trail because someone else went off the trail. And so you're like, oh, I think this is the trail. And then you find out, once you hike it for a little bit, you're like, this is not a trail. And you normally find out it's not a trail because of the overgrowth and the stuff that you suddenly start finding on the trail. I was hiking the Grand Canyon one time, and it was a mule trail. And so, logically, anywhere you walk should be able to be maneuvered by a mule. And I was hiking by myself, and suddenly I find myself clambering down rocks and scrabbling down these embankments. And I can do it because, I was young and athletic, and I was like, oh, and then I would pause, and I would go, how would a mule get down here? I'm off the trail. And so I'd have to climb back up the rocks, and I'd walk a little ways, and I was like, oh, that was a switchback. The trail went like this, and then literally turned around and went like that. And I didn't catch it, and I just kept going straight and right over the ledge and went down, and I'm like, this does not look like the trail anymore. And what the Bible is doing here is it's using that type of illustration. And look what verse 5. It's saying that if you're the type of guy who you're on that path, you're on that trail, and you're like, I am not going to listen to anyone, I'm not going to pay attention to anyone else's guidance, I don't care what they say. It goes, oh, okay, congratulations. You're going to go off the trail. And if you're so stubborn that you just keep walking off the trail, you are going to walk yourself right into a blackberry bush. That's going to feel really awesome. And so he says, if you are the person who's froward, if you're that person who is stubborn and corrupt, the other idea of froward is perverse, like you're basically living for yourself. And it says, verse 5, that thorns and snares are in the way of the froward. So they went off the trail. They left the path. They ended up in the bushes, and they were so stubborn, they were like, I'm not being stopped by no blackberries. And they just kept forging through. And if you've ever tried to push your way through a thorn bush, you understand it has a way of getting your attention. And I love the way Proverbs puts it, because the Proverbs will say things like, there is a rod that is set aside for the fool's back. And, you might beat a scorner and he won't listen. And so the idea is God will sometimes use these corrections, and the whole thing he's trying to do is get us back on track. And if we're very, very stubborn, we don't listen. And God might have to turn the heat up a little bit. This is where Paul is. So if you get Saul in the Bible, Saul is traveling. He's going from place to place to place persecuting Christians. And you get to the point where God literally knocks Saul onto his face. Saul looks up and he goes, who art thou, Lord? And he goes, Saul, it's Christ whom you persecute. And he goes, it is hard for you to kick against the pricks. And the idea was, that whether it was the little spiky things on the front of the wagon or some sort of cattle prod, the idea was Saul's conscience was prodding him and stabbing him and trying to get him to move, and he kept stubbornly kicking against those things. And the image is of a mule or a donkey who, when it's stubborn, you take a cattle prod and you're poking that thing in the backside trying to get it to move, and it will sometimes kick back like this. Well, when it kicks back, it's exposing the soft part at the bottom of its foot. And so if you kick a cattle prod with the soft part of the foot, that hurts. It does some damage to the hoof. And so you can imagine this animal with a little soft underside, and it's going like this. And Jesus is saying to Saul, it's really hard for you to keep doing this, isn't it? Like, you feel the thorns, you feel the pricks, you feel the stabbing. Why do you keep kicking? Now, I want to look at one other passage here, because, again, I haven't looked at Ecclesiastes in at least a week. But look at Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes, and I want you to look at Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, and again, Ecclesiastes chapter 12, you should know it by now, it's a big giant poem on death. Okay? So the whole first part of Ecclesiastes chapter 12 is just all the different ways to die. Okay, it's just talking about old age. But as you get to after that poem, you look at verse 8. So Ecclesiastes 12, verse 8. It says, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. Okay, so he's saying, like, all these things you live for, all these things we go after, there's an emptiness to them. There's a fleeting aspect to all the things we could live for. But look at verse 9. It says, and moreover, because the preacher was wise. So this is the conclusion to the whole book. He says, okay, you got the guy, the preacher, that's the name of the guy who's presenting the book of Ecclesiastes, the Kohelet, if you want the word. And he says, this guy gets up, this preacher, and he's presenting the book of Ecclesiastes like it's some sort of lecture or Jewish TED Talk. He's basically saying, I'm presenting this for your consideration. Live for God while you can, because there's going to come a day when you can't. And that's what he's trying to summarize. And he goes, okay, I've lived all this stuff. I have suffered this. I've gone through this. I've lived for all these things you could live for. I'm telling you, at the end of the day, anything lived for apart from God is not worth it. And that's the point of Ecclesiastes. That's why Ecclesiastes is so cynical. Because what he's trying to do is he's trying to say, let's just lift up everything we could possibly go after, and I'm just going to systematically tear it down one after another to say it's not worth going after. And so he says, all right, I realize that because I just presented all of my faults, all my failures, you might look at me as stupid and not worth listening. That's where he's going. He's saying, because the preacher was wise, even though I did all these foolish things, I still have my wisdom. And I did it, and I recorded it so that you would learn from it. And that's what he's trying to say. He goes, moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. So even though he says, like, there's ultimately no value in all this stuff, I'm going to teach it to you because I want you to learn the lesson. Don't go after these things. But he, again, he's understanding, my name might sink into obscurity. All my wealth is going to burn up. Like, nothing that I do really will ultimately matter if it's not done for God. But I'm still going to teach you these things because I want you to understand what I'm trying to get at. And Solomon, who's most likely the author of Ecclesiastes, it says he sought out and he took good heed and he set in order many proverbs, which is Ecclesiastes, which is the book of Proverbs, which we've been studying, all of this. So he put all this stuff in place to prevent us from making the same issue. But then look what it says. Verse 10. The preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even the words of truth. And so again, it echoes some of the same language that we've looked at in the beginning of Proverbs 22, where he says, this is what's worth listening to. This is the wisdom that I've boiled down. I've gotten it to its barest, most potent aspects. I've told you about some of the escape room conventions I got to go to. And last week I showed you that fake moss in the bottle. One of the things, it's hilarious. There's a company called Froggy's Fog, all right, and they make fog machines appropriately. But what they do is you can get concentrated scents. So they make all of these little scent capsules, and they're super, super concentrated, like essential oil level concentrations. And you can put it in the fog, and then when it bubbles out, it produces that smell in the room. And so you could get cannon fire. So if you have a pirate ship, you get a cannon fire smell. And you get this little concentrated drop of like pure cannon smoke, and it smells like a pirate ship. And then they're like, because it's gross, they're like, let's do rotting flesh. And you're like, why? And you open the bottle and you're like, I really don't want this. And you're like, I'm good. And they're like, oh, do you want to try skunk? And you're like, no, I'm good. Can I go with bubble gum, please? But they've got all of these little bottles of really super concentrated scents that they're like, do not take this bottle and just dump it on yourself or you'll die. And the idea is it's so concentrated, so boiled down. It's like the essence of whatever's in that bottle. That's like the book of Ecclesiastes. It's the essence of wisdom boiled down to its like purest, most like turns your nose and just kind of makes your eyes water type. And what sermons do is they take that and they dilute it a little bit so that we can handle it. And that's what he's trying to do. He says, I took all the wisdom of my life and I boiled it and boiled it and boiled it and boiled it until it was concentrated bottle of wisdom. Be very, very careful with it. And that's the idea. And Solomon goes, if you take this too far, it probably will kill you. So just let's be wise in how we disperse this because it's super concentrated. And that's what he's doing. He says, I gave heed, I sought acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even the words of truth. And I remember when I was a kid, we had a park ranger come by our school, and he had concentrated skunk spray. And he said, all right, I want you to smell what concentrated skunk spray smells like. And he brought the little bottle around, and one of my classmates like left the room to go throw up or something. I mean, it was that bad. That's what Solomon's doing. He's saying, I want a visceral reaction to what I'm about to say. And so he says, the preacher sought out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even the words of truth. And then it goes this, verse 11, comes back to the thorns, come back to the prickers, and it says, the words of the wise are as goads. And I said, if you get hit in the face with the purest form of wisdom, it should cause a reaction. And so what Solomon's doing here is he says, I want you to imagine a cattle prod, like a big, big old spiky stick. You got this big stubborn horse, you got this big spiky stick, and it says the words of the wise should sink in to the flesh of our backside and cause a visceral reaction when it pokes us. The words of the wise are as goads. And so what happens is, here we are, we're sitting, minding our own business, being stubborn, and God throws a thorn bush in our path to go, you might want to take another route. And we can keep going, no, no, and I'm going to push through and I will do this. And so the Bible says, okay, the words of the wise are going to be like that big old cattle prod that then comes along and we're going, no, I'm going to do it my way and I'm going to do it in my timing and I will do it this. And it goes, okay, well, buckle up. And that big old cattle prod goes. And we have the option then to go, ow, I'm going to go away from that. Or we can continue to be stubborn, and that's where Paul was, where Jesus had to literally knock him off his feet, blind him, shine a bright light in his face, and go, it's kind of hard to keep pushing against these pricks, isn't it? Because clearly he was under conviction and being prodded and prodded and prodded and prodded. And Saul was like, no, I'm doing this for the right reason. I'm going to keep doing this. And so God was like, I mean, that's what it is. And so this idea of wisdom is this super concentrated thing that hits us. And it should cause a reaction. But here's the beauty. If you keep going with this illustration, Solomon gets a little complicated with his illustration. First one's really simple. Cattle prod, right up the backside. Just, ouch. Should move away from it. But then it goes, but the words of the wise are so good that they're a cattle prod pushing you in one direction. But look what it says. And they're also as nails that are fastened. Okay, if you've ever had a tent spike, you understand this illustration. A tent spike is this guy wire that comes down off the side of your tent, you hammer it into the ground, and now you have fastened that nail in the ground, and I can take a wire, hook it off to the wire, and it'll hold whatever it's connected to up. And I told you the story about the big tree that was being held up. The tree was rotten and broken, being held up by a guy wire that was running down and attached to this giant metal stake in the ground. And that was all that was holding the tree up. And we literally went and cut everything else connected to that tree up. And somehow that guy wire was powerful enough that even though that tree was literally bending, it was somehow still standing. And we looked at that and we were like, how are you still upright? Because it had a really powerful guy wire attached to a really, really deep nail. And so we took a chop saw and we cut that cable, and that tree fell apart before it hit the ground. Because it was all being held up by that cable. And that's what wisdom does. Like, you could be an absolutely broken, shattered person, and you attach yourself with a guy wire to the right nail. I don't know how I'm standing, but I'm standing. Now, the moment you cut that guy wire, you might just fall to pieces. But that's the illustration. So Solomon says, the words of the wise are like a cattle prod in the backside and a big giant guy wire that's holding you up. And then the masters of assembly is just like what he's doing. He's preaching and teaching. So the words of the wise that you hear from preaching and teaching and studying the Bible, they're going to be a cattle prod to poke you in the right direction. Don't push against the pricks. And they're going to be a guy wire that holds you up. And that's, again, what Proverbs 22 is saying. Thorns and snares are in the way of the froward, but he doth keep his soul shall be far from them. So when you feel that prod, when you feel that poke, and when you find yourself up to your armpits in thorns, you go, I'm not on the trail anymore. Maybe I should check my map. And you look at your map and go, it went off right there. And instead of being stubborn and going, well, I'll just keep forging through and maybe I'll come out on the other side, that's not how trails work. Just turn around, get back on the trail, and you'll be fine. And so that's this illustration. And again, that's where we'll go, Lord willing, next week, is we'll start looking at some of the ways we use this. So, all right, that's the introduction to Proverbs 22. All right, questions or comments?